What's up folks, CrossSG back with my review of the new 5-star Pyro unit, Hutao. Sorry if I sound a bit weird, I'm a little under the weather and my throat's a bit scratchy. Anyway, if you haven't seen my poll video, go check it out for a quick lesson on how to C6 a 5-star unit that you don't use. So I know some of you were hoping for a video sooner and I had planned to do one, but realized very quickly after I got her that it wasn't gonna happen. There was just too much to test, too many ways to play her, and I had a lot of trouble piecing my thoughts together in such a short time. Because of this, I've decided to take the advice of some of my viewers, and instead of trying to squeeze a copious amount of gameplay into a shorter video, I'll put a whole list of gameplay clips in the description as well as in the pinned comment so you guys can view it after this video. Let's go over my thoughts briefly. So I think Hutao is an excellent unit with main carry and sub DPS or burst support potential, though I'd lean more toward her being a main carry than a sub DPS personally. She is highly capable at C0 and gets better with Constellations, but more on that in a bit. Now I hate to use another cliche word, but it was almost scary testing her, in a good way. Let's talk about her talents and general playstyle first because things can get a little complicated. I'll only focus on the important bits to save time, and I'll leave a link to Genshin Impact in the description so that you can check out her full kit in detail. So Hutao's primary mechanic is her sub 50% HP playstyle. Keeping her below 50% HP grants various benefits from her kit. The first benefit comes from her Ascension talent Sanguine Rouge, which grants a 33% pyro damage boost when she is below 50% HP. The second benefit would be her burst, which deals more damage when you are below 50% HP. Because of this mechanic, you'll generally be looking to build your team around keeping her below that HP threshold as much as possible, and this is most easily accomplished using a shield generator like Xiangling, Noelle, Diona or Xingqiu. More on them later. Looking at her second talent, we have Flutterby, which gives 12% crit rate bonus to the rest of the team after Hutao's E-skill ends. Now this might seem insignificant at first glance, but it can be extremely helpful depending on the team that you run. Onto the bread and butter of her kit, we have her E-skill, which grants a huge attack boost based on her max HP and converts all her attacks to pyro damage for its duration. It also causes her charge attacks to apply the Blood Blossom dot effect, which is decent on its own, but gets even better with C2. Now when I say her E-skill grants a huge attack boost, I do mean huge. It can literally double your sheet attack for the duration of her E-skill. Noelle's and Xiao's burst are probably the best analogies for how Hutao's E-skill works, except that, like Xiao's burst, you lose the bonus if you swap to a different character. Fortunately, unlike both Xiao and Noelle, this is an E-skill, it's not a burst, so you don't need to worry about energy recharge to get it back up. Speaking of energy recharge, normal and charge attacks performed during her E-skill window have a chance to generate 2 to 3 particles every 5 or 6 seconds, which totals in 4 to 6 particles per E rotation. Anyway, back to the attack buff. The small caveat here is that the buff is capped to 400% of Hutao's total base attack, the white stat here. Now this probably won't matter to most players because it's pretty hard to cap out the bonus unless you are kind of an outlier, perhaps running the white Tassel with the equivalent of my 4-piece bowlight set. At over 36k HP, I'd be overcapped with the white Tassel at anything above a level 7 skill. Here's a table showing the buff caps with various weapon base attack values and their associated max HP thresholds. So that's her E-skill, and from this point, everything else revolves around it. Looking at her combat talents, the most noteworthy would be her charge attack. Not because it has an unusually large modifier, it doesn't, but more so because of its interaction with her E-skill. As mentioned earlier, charge attacks during her E-skill apply the Blood Blossom dot, which provides extra sustain damage. Second, and more importantly, her charge attack loses its internal cooldown while her E-skill is active, allowing you to essentially spam it as long as you have stamina available, which makes her C1 a very good constellation to have. That said, as you will see in the gameplay clips, depending on your team setup and playstyle preferences, you don't necessarily have to spam her charge attacks to deal decent damage. You can do perfectly fine mixing things up or running some sort of fixed attack rotation. I personally don't really bother too much with fixed rotations. The encounters currently available are not nearly long enough for me to get into full DPS tunnel mode, so I usually just wing my rotation. Her charge attack also can be cancelled out of with a dash or a jump, and the primary purpose of using an animation cancel here is to stop the dash through mechanic of her charge attack. As you can see, her charge dashes a pretty long distance and can often leave you out of range of your target. Doing a jump or a dash cancel right after using her charge attack allows you to stay within range of the target as much as possible. It's a little hard to get the cancel timing right, especially for those with boomer hands like myself, but it's important to practice this if you intend to use a charge attack regularly or things could get really annoying really fast. Finally, we have her burst, which deals a hit of pyro damage in a large AoE. It also heals you for a % of your max HP per target hit, up to a maximum of 5 enemies. It has a pretty chunky damage modifier, and as mentioned earlier, it gains about 25% more modifier if used when Hutao is below 50% HP, and the heal increases as well. This can result in some pretty insane burst damage numbers, especially when Melt and Vaporize are involved, but it deals more than enough damage in pure Pyro teams if built right. Over to her constellations, as mentioned earlier, C1 is a really useful constellation because it gives you free use of her charge attack for the duration of her E skill. This utility isn't just limited to damage though, it also gives you an insane amount of mobility should you need to reposition yourself for any reason or chase enemies down. The exception being Fatui mages, which completely mess with the targeting mechanic of her charge attack. Talk about a keyboard crushing experience. I personally have C1, but I haven't unlocked it yet because I wanted to get as much testing as possible done at C0 first. Moving on, her C2 is pretty decent because it more than doubles Blood Blossom's damage and allows her burst to apply Blood Blossom as well. Another benefit to her C2 is it helps mitigate the lack of a snapshot mechanic from her Blood Blossom. To elaborate a little, Hutao's Blood Blossom's base damage does not snapshot. It actively updates its damage based on her attack value at the point when the tick occurs. Now with her C2, your Blossom base damage will still drop once her E skill ends, but you won't lose the 10% bonus damage gained from max HP. And because the bonus damage can more than double your base Blossom damage, you will probably see something closer to 20-something K dropping to only about 15k with C2. So there we have it, pretty decent constellation. Moving on. Now C3 and C5 do their usual +3 levels to her E and burst skills, and her C4 is, well, it's okay. It has a longer duration than the buff from her Flutterby talent, and I assume both the buffs stack. The reason why I am less impressed by her C4 versus Flutterby's shorter buff is entirely because it is a C4. Great as a base ascension bonus, mediocre as a C4. And finally we have her C6, and whether you find it good or bad really comes down to your playstyle preferences and perspective. If you like chasing big numbers, then it's a great constellation. Grab that C6, get that R5 homeless, stack a bunch of crit damage, and boom, big PP damage once every 60 seconds. For me personally, as mentioned in my pull video, I think it's pretty gimmicky. A 16% uptime puts me in a tight spot. The more crit rate I have in my build, the less value I get from a C6. Yet having no crit rate only gives me a boost 16% of the time. I'd take it if it was maybe a C4, but not as a C6. Moving on, let's take a look at her stat priorities before we talk about artifacts. Because of how her kit functions, Hutao will scale better with % HP than % attack, and this difference only increases the higher your E skill level is. For those worried about capping the attack bonus, as mentioned earlier, don't fret, it's pretty hard to cap the bonus. So for artifact main stats, you generally want to go for pyro damage on the goblet, % HP on the timepiece, and one of the crit stats on the headpiece depending on your current crit ratio. As with most units, a 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio is generally more optimal. Again, this is just a guideline. Depending on artifact RNG, you may find more success with different combinations of main stats. Using my Petra set as an example, I don't have a % HP Petra Sans. I'm using a % attack one. Thus, going with % HP on my headpiece actually gives me more DPS than going with a crit stat headpiece. For substats, things are a little more nuanced. Crit stats are generally a high priority, of course, but beyond that, if you run any form of reaction comp, EM has good DPS value up to a point, even more so than %HP. I'd put that threshold at about 100 EM. Here's how I would recommend prioritizing substats. If you run a reaction comp, go for crit stats if available, followed by EM up to about 100 EM. Then %HP takes precedence the rest of the way. %attack still provides decent value, so it doesn't hurt to have some. However, if you have to choose specifically between %attack and EM, I'd personally go with EM if you have less than 200. Now if you don't run a reaction comp, things are much simpler. Crit stats followed by %HP followed by %attack. Again, these are just guidelines. Use a damage calculator if you want a more accurate answer for your unique stats. Okay, let's talk artifacts, and there are a few options here, but the one that most will probably look at would be the 4-piece Witches set. 15% pyro damage, 15% reaction damage with an additional 7.5% pyro damage from one stack, totaling in 22.5% pyro damage. Needless to say, this will be the set of choice when running Hutao in any form of reaction team, which most probably would do. The next option would be the 4-piece Hydro set. And while this is categorically inferior to most of the other 4-piece sets, an argument can be made for this as a very good general purpose set, because the bonus itself is completely unconditional. If you want just one jack-of-all-trades set that functions across the board in all teams under any conditions, this would be the set I'd recommend. There are also two other general-purpose options in the form of 4-piece Gladiators or 2-piece Witches with 2-piece Noblesse. These are both decent options for general use, but they do fall ever so slightly short of the 4-piece Hydro set in my opinion. At the end of the day, between the three general-purpose options, go with whichever gives you the best stats. For those wondering about 2-piece Witches with 2-piece Glad, that's just the least optimal of the bunch, so I wouldn't specifically build for that. Now from here, the rest of the artifact sets are either comp-specific or have special requirements. First, we have 4-piece Bowlight, which is an excellent set to use if you run a shield generator on your team. If you can keep that shield up 100% of the time where it counts, I'd rank this as the best general purpose set, period. Next would be the 4-piece Lava Walker, and this one is the king of the hill for Pyro-only comps where you can reliably keep the Pyro application on the target. In terms of overall damage output, all else equal, Lava Walkers comes out ahead of Bowlight because that 35% bonus damage applies to everything in Hutao's kit. And finally we have 4-piece Petra, and this is on par with Lava Walker if you have a reliable way of generating Pyro crystals. I know this preference will be debated by many because you lose out on the option of doubling up Petra on a Geo support with any other set on Hutao herself, and this is 100% true. However, as I've explained a couple of times, I'm personally not a fan of having to crystal hunt on my supports, and I've personally run 4-piece Petra on Hutao with much success. Now, and speaking of supports, let's talk about some of the popular ones. First up, we have Xingqiu, who is in my opinion one of the best support units for Hutao. He brings damage reduction and most importantly, extremely reliable, consistent off-field hydro application for Vaporize. Now this synergy is so good that while his Q is up, you can almost guarantee that every charge attack performed by Hutao will trigger Vaporize, increasing her damage immensely. Next we have Xiangling, and she is a really good support unit for a Pyro-only team or a general cross-melt or cross-vaporize team where the focus is general sustained DPS output rather than trying to set up for a big burst-only amplification reaction. She brings an attack buff from Gorba's Chili Drop, Pyro Shred at C1, and a Pyro damage bonus at C6. Now the primary challenge for Xiangling is to get enough ER on her to have her burst up every rotation. In my tests, outside of running her with Fischl for regen, I had to run no less than 200% ER to achieve full uptime. Looking at melt supports, we have Kea, Ganyu, Chongyun, and to an extent Diona. In my opinion, Kea is probably the most consistent one here. His burst is kinda short, but he applies cryo very quickly. Coupled with Xingqiu, you are pretty much guaranteed a melt or vaporize whenever you decide to use Hutao's burst, and this is on top of the guaranteed vaporize every charge attack use with Xingqiu, which can then be converted to melts very often with Kea for even more damage. Now Ganyu has a longer burst duration, but her application rate is much slower, especially in encounters with only a few enemies. Chongyun is less of a melt support and more of a buff and cooldown support with reverse melt DPS capabilities. He brings a small attack speed buff with his Ascension talent and 15% cooldown reduction at C2, and his burst can be set up to melt every rotation right after Hutao's E expires. Now Diona brings very slow cryo application. However, she brings 200 EM with her C6, which can be used in tandem with Bennett's attack buff to completely offset the lack of buffs when Hutao is above 50% HP. Her shield hold activation can also be a reliable controlled setup for an immediate Hutao E into burst melt combo. Looking at shield support specifically, we have Zhongli, Noelle, Diona, and Xinyan. Zhongli is by far the best shield support for Hutao. He has a short cooldown, beefy shield that can be kept up 100% of the time and brings a universal resistance shred. Noelle has a long cooldown on her shield, but her shield can also be built to be as beefy as Zhongli's. And as you will see in the gameplay linked below, Noelle is very viable as the solo shield support for Hutao. Her talent Devotion is extremely useful here because it acts as a mini cheat death that essentially gives you a free shield every 3 rotations, making her rotations generally more manageable with her long cooldown. Diona brings a decent shield if built for full HP, and as mentioned earlier, sets up for a non-HP specific team nicely with Bennett. Lastly, we have Xinyan, who has the weakest shield among the shield generators, but she is a Pyro unit, so she brings Pyro Resonance and limited Pyro particle generation. She can be built as a viable shield support, but she would be the last choice of the bunch for me personally. The final 2 prominent supports for Hutao would be Bennett and Fischl. I've already kinda explained Bennett's core functionality, so use him if you don't want to bother with the 50% HP mechanic. His buff can make up for some of what we lose ignoring this mechanic. That said, it is certainly possible to run Bennett while still maintaining below 50% HP. His buff is set to a specific area, so all you need to do is run away, cast his buff, run back, and fight outside of the buff area so you don't get healed. Though it's worth noting that without C1, Bennett's attack buff only applies if you are above 70% HP, so just be mindful of that. Now Fischl, on the other hand, is great for her ability to generate lots of bonus damage from reactions, particularly at C6. But more importantly, she brings a unique energy regen mechanic via Oz, and I've talked about it in a few of my past Noelle videos. I recently found out that this mechanic specifically was given the name Turbo by Kaching mains, so maybe that rings a bell for some. A quick summary is that whenever Oz triggers Overload or Superconduct, it will also generate 1 additional energy particle per target hit by the reaction's AoE, and this can result in pretty insane energy regen for the team, particularly in mobbing scenarios. I would, however, caution that this mechanic is significantly less effective against bosses or the current floor 12 because less enemies means less regen. Okay, that's it for supports. Let's take a look at some team comps, and I'm just gonna put this out there first. I have tested many comps on Hutao, but there are an equal number that I have not tested personally because it's just not humanly possible to test that many comps in just a few days at my regular whale levels of investment. Thus, I'm only going to talk about my favorite comps and their variations. Lastly, I will try to avoid ranking the comps by damage efficacy because it's just way too subjective. Instead, I'll rank them based on what suits my personal playstyle and preferences. First up, we have a Melt and Vaporize comp with shields, and this consists of Hutao, Zhongli, Kea, and Xingqiu. Ganyu does kinda work in place of Kea here, but as mentioned earlier, I find Kea to be significantly more reliable for cryo application. Now this is probably my favorite team because it is one of the easiest to play, at least the way I have it set up. Zhongli exists for shields and resistance shred, allowing me to keep Hutao at sub 50% HP almost indefinitely. Kea and Xingqiu bring lots of cryo and hydro aura for Hutao to trigger off of, and the high chance of freezing is a nice CC and melt aura as well. My Hutao is of course in 4-piece witches for this comp, and you'll need to build both Kea and Xingqiu for maximum energy recharge so that they have their bursts up every single rotation. Gameplay linked in the pinned comment. Next we have a Pyro-only comp with shields. Hutao, Xiangling, with either Zhongli or Noelle for shields, plus any second Geo unit for 15% damage bonus from Geo Resonance. Again, easy team to play. Just get Hutao below 50% HP, keep the shields up, use Xiangling's skills before going ham on Hutao. 4-piece Lava Walker would be the best set for this, but I personally use 4-piece Bowlight because I don't have a good Lava Walker set. Moving on, I call this next team the forget this 50% HP nonsense team. As the name suggests, it completely ignores the sub 50% HP mechanic entirely. Hutao, Diona, Bennett, and Xingqiu. Diona at C6 for 200 EM and strategic cryo application. Bennett because his attack buff counters the lack of the sub 50% HP benefits, and Xingqiu of course for vaporize support. All the usual reaction support such as an EM Sucrose or Venti work here too, but I don't have either of them built, so I made do with what I had. A C0 Zhongli works very well in place of Diona as well if you don't have a C6 Diona, though you lose melt capabilities and have to settle for vaporize if you use Zhongli. Now this comp puts out very competitive damage even without being at sub 50% HP, and it is exceedingly easy to run because you don't have to worry about that whole HP thing. I've run it with my R1 Homa and R1 Blackcliff and R5 Dragonsbane, and they all clear floor 12 chambers in under 1 minute with ease. And finally we have my transformative reaction comp with Hutao, Diona, Fischl, and Xingqiu. Of course this is far from the only way to run such a team, this is just how I personally run it. As the name suggests, the basis of this comp is to generate as many electro-based transformative reactions as possible to capitalize on Fischl's second talent as well as the bonus damage from her C6. Hutao functions mostly as the Pyro aura, Fischl is of course central to this comp as explained earlier, and Xingqiu brings Hydro application for electrocharge procs. By virtue of having Diona on the team, yes, this is also a team that ignores the 50% HP mechanic. The damage potential here is deceptively good and more than makes up for not being below 50% HP. Now while this comp is easy to play, the overload reaction can be somewhat of a double-edged sword. It makes up for what Hutao lacks in shield breaking potential, but the knockback can be pretty annoying on smaller enemies. Though for the most part, smaller enemies die really quickly, so it doesn't really matter. Alright, let's talk about weapons, and I gotta be honest here folks, I'm not sure if there is really a point in me doing a weapon analysis for Hutao with the wealth of information available out there already. But let's take a look regardless. Getting the obvious out of the way first, the Staff of Homa is her best in slot weapon across the board by a huge margin. It was clearly designed entirely and specifically for Hutao, and the gains are as clear as day. There is no contest. That said, if you are F2P, low spending, or were unlucky enough to have your wallet gravestoned by the weapon banner, we have a few other options. The Deathmatch from the Battle Pass is an excellent weapon for Hutao. It provides a huge amount of crit rate as its secondary, which is extremely good, much like how crit damage secondary is great on the Staff of Homa and Blackcliff Pole. The downside about this weapon is the combination of its low base attack value and its percent attack bonus. Hutao already has a low inherent base attack. Adding a low base attack weapon to the equation diminishes the value of its percent attack bonus. Nonetheless, the large amount of crit rate it brings certainly puts it at the top of the 4-star heap. Moving on, we have the 5-star Jade Wing Spear. Like the Deathmatch, the Jade Spear has crit rate as its secondary, though much less of it, and its bonus gives a stacking percent attack buff plus a universal damage bonus at max stacks. The Jade Spear is generally a very good weapon, but its main flaw is that the weapon bonus stacks up to 7 times, meaning you'd realistically only gain the full bonus about halfway through your E rotation. The stacks also only last for 6 seconds, so if your off-field rotation takes any longer than 6 seconds, you'll have to stack that bonus all over again on the next E rotation. For this reason, I can't say that it is conclusively better or worse than the Deathmatch for Hutao. Next on the list would be the Blackcliff Pole, and this is basically a mini Staff of Homa in the sense that it has crit damage as its secondary, so you'd build for both weapons in the exact same way. While not quite as good as the Deathmatch or the Jade Spear, I'd reckon that this is one of the easiest options to acquire because it only costs 24 star glitter for R1, which is really all you need, and that's pretty attainable even for an F2P player. Alright, so the remaining weapons are highly situational, so you should only consider them if you meet their unique requirements. First up, we have the Lithic Spear, and as mentioned in my Lithic Weapons Thoughts video, my general guideline would be to only pull for Lithic weapons if you have the means to double down for at least an R4 and run at least 3 Lier characters on your team. However, this value argument only applies to those who are still considering if they should pull for it. If you have already pulled on the weapon banner and ended up with a Lithic Spear, here's the breakdown. An R1 Lithic Spear with 4 Lier characters on the team is a tiny bit better than an R2 Lithic Spear with 3 Lier characters, which in turn is about equal to an R1 Blackcliff Pole. An R4 Lithic Spear is about equal to the Deathmatch with 3 Lier characters, and it beats the Deathmatch with 4 Lier characters. An R5 Lithic Spear is just the best in slot 4 star for Hutao with 3 or more Lier characters. Next we have the Dragonsbane, and this has the potential to be an excellent weapon if run with the appropriate melt or vaporize comp. It gets significantly better with refined ranks and is definitely worth considering if you are able to maintain a high reaction trigger rate with decent crit stats. At R5, I'd rate the Dragonsbane just shy if not equal to an R5 full stack Lithic Spear if you meet its requirements. And finally, we have the popular 3-star White Tassel, and while this is indeed a very decent weapon for Hutao at R5, potentially rivaling the best in normal attack damage, the caveat is that it is only good with normal attacks and falls short in every other aspect of her kit. The bottom line, in my opinion, is that the White Tassel is only worth considering if you don't have any of the earlier mentioned options. Here are a couple of charts to help visualize how the weapons stack up against each other. As always, your mileage may vary depending on your stats. Alright folks, let's wrap things up. Overall, I think Hutao is a phenomenal unit, and I thoroughly enjoy playing her. She is very versatile and can be run in many different comps ranging from high risk, high reward comps to no risk, no skill required comps. Her best in slot weapon is absolutely broken, but she does perfectly fine even with something like an R1 Blackcliff Pole. She is utterly capable at just C0, with C1 being her strongest constellation in my opinion. She does get progressively stronger with C2, C3 and C5, but C4 and C6 are kinda lackluster to me personally. Her two main weaknesses are that A, she deals only pyro damage, so the usual mob resistance issues apply. And B, she doesn't have personal heavy shield break potential. But both of these can be overcome easily with various team setups. Onto my pull recommendation, and Hutao is the first 5-star that gets an easy instant yes from me. She is definitely worth pulling for if you remotely like her character or her kit. C0 brings full value, but you could go for C1 if you want some extra value, but I can't recommend pulling any more than that. And that brings us to the end of my Hutao review, or guide, or whatever you want to call this. It's such a long video, it could very well double as a guide, I think. Once again, links to additional gameplay footage are in the description and in the pinned comment below. As always, thumbs up if you liked it, share my videos with your friends, crush that subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, folks.